Yeah, sure.
Welcome to Principles Only, the two-man show with Martin, Sieff, and Pelle Neroth Taylor, where just the two of us are discussing the topic of the day. Well, today we're going to talk about an article I did for my Substack, which I'll link to at the bottom, which has got had some feedback, positive feedback, and it's very gratifying when you get subscribers dropping in, because you know that they're quite long essays that I write, and when people start appreciating, you know that they uh, take your work seriously. And a lot of names from all over the world, actually, Indians, Germans, uh, Americans, Spanish people, even, So it's an international issue. I mean, and I'll talk about that in a second. I just want to say that today is the 29th of June, which is the anniversary, but one day of the 28th of June, 1914. And we know what
Yes.
happened then, don't we, Martin? It was the Franz Ferdinand was shot 102 years ago. And I say that because a lot of the alternative media have been talking, and not so alternative media, have been talking about the possibility of an imminent war. And others might say, well, that's totally nonsense because that's not going to happen. But never forget that the hot summer of 1914, we're in the hot summer of 2026, hottest summer ever, actually, so far in June. People were rowing famously, that watching the regatta at Henley or playing cricket or enjoying the last summer before the deluge sort of thing. And he was assassinated on the 28th. And that story was in a remote Balkan place no one had heard of and no one thought much of. And suddenly, a month later, the world was aflame. So I think that some people have actually talked about a possible Franz Ferdinand moment, that moment which spins the great powers who are in a very tense relationship at the moment into the whirlpool and ends up with war. Um, I don't want to necessarily talk about that. We'll talk. We've got a guest on this week that'll be able to talk about it from their perspective. And we don't just want to duplicate the doomsters on the big alternative media. But what I'll say is um, that sense of tension, which is sort of strong in Europe and the UK right now, was actually reminds me of the sense of tension in the 1980s in Sweden during these submarine intrusions. Now, everyone of a certain age in
Yes.
Sweden, let's say over 50 or something, you all have to say is submarine Sweden or submarine hunt Sweden, and people know exactly. It's like you flick a switch and they remember exactly what they were doing because every day for years on end, for let's say a couple of weeks a year, perhaps twice a year, once in the spring and once in the autumn, there were these submarine hunts. And it was assumed to be the Russians planning an attack on Sweden or scouting around and sending their mini subs which had tracks on them, and they were sort of nosing around. Sweden has the world's largest number of islands or something. I mean, huge number of islands. It's like a crumbled biscuit coast, basically, all the way up 2,000 kilometers worth. And many Swedes have summer cottages and jetties and little rowboats and little motorboats. And all the Swedes who had that set up were convinced that any time now a Soviet frogman would turn up at the bottom of the jetty with a Kalashnikov having been deposited there by a Russian mini submarine. Um, Now, the what happened was that the pattern would repeat itself every year throughout the 1980s, and that is the Swedish Navy, some stern-looking general or admiral would say the Russia, that we've had a signal here that indicates there's a foreign intruder, and then what would happen was the Swedish television crews would scramble down to the location alongside the coast where this had taken place. Sometimes it was all the way up in Lapland. Sometimes it was down in the Baltic, far down in Skåne or Blekinge. And there would be photos, shots of helicopters hovering above this of the flat, scary landscape. As I said, lots of little islands. And there'd be patrol boats moving up and down, and sometimes you would have a Swedish submarine going sort of on the surface, and then you'd have, well, we think we've found someone. We've dropped depth charges, and sometimes you see the television footage of huge depth charges erupting, and then you'd hear, "Oh well, we didn't catch them tonight, but we'll come back tomorrow." And this was a day time when Sweden only had two TV channels, and it started at 6 p.m. with the children's programs. Ironically, the Soviet crocodile program, I can't remember what it's called in English, um, but so it would, in Swedish, but between let's say 4 and 6 in the afternoon, it was there was this kind of live recording of submarine hunts, which were nearly always fruitless. In fact, they were all fruitless. Nothing ever happened, but it kept people in a state of incredible tension. And
Yes.
Sweden, of course, hadn't had a war for 200 years, kept out of war. This was all they had, um, and I remember going to England for my summers because I spent, I was living in two countries. My parents were separated, and trying to tell the British exactly what was going on because it didn't travel very much. There was, I said, well, you realize we're at World War Three sort of thing. And they said, nonsense. We're not hearing anything. But as long as you're in the borders of Scandinavia, there was a very strong feeling that war could break out any moment, and you had this. It was a real sense of psychological disturbance in this otherwise extremely prosperous country. And it said it went on for years. It went on. 1982 was the first big one, 1989, 1990. And what happened later was there were a number of studies done. The studies done contemporaneously. The first one in 1983, where Carl Bildt, who was later foreign minister and prime minister, uh, produced a report that pointed out the Soviets. But actually, there was a guy who, Sweden's top investigative journalist, looked at that report, and it was very thin on the ground evidence wise. And he said it said things like the acoustic, radiological, and uh, uh, intention evidence all points to the Soviets. Well, turns out when he dug in deeper into it that the reporters only read the executive summary, but the actual main report itself, which very few people read, Shades of Kennedy Assassination, didn't prove the things that they said. So, for instance, it said that um, the submarine because they what found the scuba divers found prints on the ground of the keel on the surface in the archipelago, and they also recorded some sounds of the submarines moving or some they're up to 5 or 6 at a time, and they had a sonar picture of the submarines and so on. And when you put all that together, it didn't point to Soviet submarines. It pointed to NATO submarines, pointed to Western submarines. So so the sonar pictures fitted very well with the two Italian mini submarines. The Italians are very good at that sort of thing. We think of the Italians as being kind of, kind of backwards. Four gears in reverse, one gear in advance. That was a Italian tank sort of thing. But they're very advanced special marine forces, and they
Yes.
designed all these mini subs. And Genoa, I think it's called the Constabini are their special forces. But there was apparently it was Americans using Italian submarines, and they fit exactly the sonar picture of that. But for instance, they said that and there were larger submarines, diesel submarines, not mini subs as well, involved, sort of 60-meter long keel tracks. And they said, well, that has to be a Soviet submarine because it fits in with a whiskey class. But actually, it also fits in pretty well with the Oberon submarine. And then when they talked to, well, we had got Russian radio signals. It turned out in an official government report in 1995 that it wasn't, that these audio signals, radio signals didn't come from Swedish territory. They came from Kaliningrad or somewhere. So when you put all these things together, there were caterpillar tracks, and the assumption they said, well, only the Soviets have mini submarines, so these caterpillar tracks have to be some from Soviet mini submarines. And you said, well, why would only the Soviets have mini submarines? Both sides have mini submarines, so that was not a determinative piece of evidence. And then they said, well, the audio record of these submarines, the audio signature was given to the Norwegians, and the Norwegians have the world's best submarine operators, audio operators, because what we know now is that the West, especially Norway, I think, could track every single submarine that the Soviets had. I mean, literally, not just the model, but like the single. So they could track it throughout its career because every single submarine had a very particular audio fingerprint to that specific example of a submarine. So they actually knew, oh, this is submarine S 120. It's there now. It's there then. So they didn't just know the model. They knew the actual identity of each, and they told this this investigative journalist who I quote in my Substack piece that yeah, it's a Western submarine, um, and it was so secret that they would nobody wanted to go out with their names. I mean, it was so hush hush because you had hundreds of journalists turning up at these things, a lot from Britain, and all reporting stuff. You could go back into the Times or New York Times archives, and it's all there. But the Swedes, of course, were there in the largest numbers, and they were all saying, "Oh, these are Soviet submarines." Um, Partly because the Soviets were right across the Baltic, and they distrusted the Soviets enormously. And because in 1981 there was a Soviet submarine that ran aground, the Whiskey on the Rocks, and because that ran aground, because it was definitely a Soviet. I mean, you just type in "Whiskey on the Rocks" and you'll see Google images. It was there for 2 weeks. It ran aground. I think that some people think it was a Western commander. They bribed the commander, the West, to run it up on the reef. Other people said it was a Soviet spy submarine. An operation went wrong, but the point was it wasn't actually running on its electrical motors when it was sailing along in the Swedish archipelago. It was riding on its diesel engines, which is a fact that the mainstream media didn't point out. And they also found that when it hit the Skerry, the underground reef, it actually used its motors to drive up further onto the reef rather than try to get off. So why were they doing that if it was a spy submarine that had run aground? So I think that and then apparently that there were it was a very old submarine and it was just inexperienced crew members on board, so it didn't have any sort of the attributes of a spy sub. And so some people think, oh, these are the Soviets, they got it wrong. And what happened afterwards that the West exploited this fact that the Soviets ran aground and were all over the Swedish archipelago for years to come, partly to train their crews. I mean, the British submarine operations had something called the periscope test. So if your final exam as a submariner is to put your men through a real life exhibition with a real live opponent, and those opponents was perhaps the Swedes. We don't know, um, but it would have suited both sides. The Swedes got training in submarines hunting. They got to show that they were wanted to buying American equipment for their. Swedes had an independent military, was neutral, but they were only able to buy American equipment if they could prove that they were willing to take on any incomers, including the Soviets. So they were showing that they were willing to take on the Soviets. They're getting training for the Swedish pro-NATO military. They were showing the neutralist government that the Soviets are our enemy, and you can't really have détente with them, as Olof Palme was doing. Um, and the British might say they were training. And actually, in the year 2000 and the year 2008, when I actually talked to the British former Navy Minister Keith Speed, they said, yeah, it was a training exercise. We were there. It was us. So, I've heard. I talked to, and I turned it into an article for the Sunday Times. So it's official that the West was all over the Swedish archipelago. Now, but
Yes.
officially that was just for training missions. Now, that doesn't exclude that there were Soviet submarines as well. But it's interesting that the guy called Bobby Inman, who was a former deputy
Oh,
chief of the
yes.
CIA, and maybe you knew him, but he was a deputy that guy, the guy Reagan's intelligence chief, the guy who died of a brain, William Casey. William
Yes, Bill
Casey.
Casey.
Yeah, Bill Casey. Anyway, his deputy was Bobby Inman, and he's still alive, I think. He said, "Well, the Soviets were in. I've seen the email. The Soviets were in Swedish waters beyond inside the 12-mile limit, but they didn't do these daring operations inside the archipelagos that we did. So it's all there. It's official. But these things, I mean, when Carl Bildt, who's made his career, became prime minister and then foreign minister from 2002, he's very heavily involved in Ukraine today, along with Sikorsky, the guy who wrote this European Association Agreement that basically got forced Ukraine to align itself with Western security policy. So that the Russians said, you can't do that. So he's been anti-Russian and anti-Soviet all his life. He was a young MP when he wrote these, and he made a career out of pointing out the Soviet guilt and the Soviets for this. Um, when he was faced with Caspar Weinberger saying the same thing and Keith Speed, I mean, it's on tape, and it wasn't just me; it was a guy from Swedish television as well. He said, "Oh, they've gone senile. What? Of course not. I mean, so he's like Boris Johnson, who's just lying out of his ass. I mean, they're not senile. I think what it was, I think what they said, maybe they thought it was genuine,
Exactly.
just training operations. Maybe it's training operations, but maybe it's a limited hangout. That is, you say something to admit the bigger thing. And I think the bigger thing was maybe that the British were training their submarine crews, and maybe the Americans. Uh, Maybe they were the Swedes had a hydrophone system that needed maintenance, an American run hydrophone system. They had something called SOSUS, which the Americans had throughout the whole Atlantic, so that's why they could help track all these Soviet submarines. God knows what they've got now. But anyway, this was already in the 70s and 80s. And the Swedes bought into that system and it had to be placed along the Swedish archipelago. So the Americans sent in mini subs to maintain that at the same time as if they shown them felt occasionally they could scare the Swedes into thinking, oh, the Soviets are invading. And that reduced, I mean, for a while in Scandinavia, the Soviet reputation, because they'd worked very hard to charm the Scandinavians into believing that, the Soviet Union was not a threat. Well, this turned up Scandinavian opinion right against the Soviets. And I would say for decades, this reputation lasted that the Swedes, they're going to attack us. Now, um, so this was actually, these theories, this became almost like a, quite well aired in the mid 2000s, 2010, by 2010. But then this new Cold War came along, and it's a whole new generation doesn't know this basically. Um, but I put it out on a Substack, and I think new generations discovered what happened, and I think it's very interesting because my view is that once people realize that deception operations take place and took place and probably still take place, then they'll be much better equipped to fight this drive to war. So I did it because it was a childhood thing. It's like the ghosts of my childhood. I wanted to solve that equation and make people understand
Yes.
it. So it was, as I said, I mean, if you were 13 or 14, as I was, it was a thrilling, but also very worrying. I mean, it was like, I remember lying on the beach and thinking a mushroom cloud could rise from, because we looked across the Baltic and over there was East Germany. They could rise any moment. I really thought that they're right, because Sweden is quite exposed on two flanks. It had the flank, the Baltic region, which was then Soviet, and then East Germany, and then Poland. So like three-quarters of Sweden it was really an outlier of the Western countries, a frontline country, and in a way that Britain wasn't. I mean, even though Britain was much more, I would say, assertive and aggressive as a Cold War warrior, the feeling in Britain was, at least in the 80s, wasn't nearly as exposed or as paranoid as the feeling in Sweden was, especially as the Swedes were trying to have dialogue with both sides. And I think it was a kind of Ostpolitik, like Willy Brandt famously in Germany, and the Swedes were really on board with that. But as long as when these submarine things came on, it killed Olof Palme's détente policy. And of course, he was assassinated just before he went to go and talk to Gorbachev, because he'd identified in Gorbachev somebody you could talk to on the Soviet side. And don't forget, just before, is that Willy Brandt, who's obviously a much more powerful figure in a much larger country, he had to go because there was a spy in his cabinet,
Oh,
Günther
yes, I
Guillaume.
remember. Famous
And
case.
from what I understand from our friend Dirk, that was an operation designed to expose him. I mean, he wasn't a spy himself, but it was like an operation designed to kill his career, basically. So he wasn't guilty himself, but basically his guilt was that he was talking to the Soviets, and he knelt before the at Warsaw, and he traded with the East Germans and so on. He recognized the Oder Neisse line and so on. So for a while, for about 10, 15 years, the East Germans and West Germans were very pro dialogue with the Soviet Union. And then, but he had to go. He was removed from that position when he was in a position because of a spy scandal for which he wasn't responsible. And our friend Dirk and those who in the know in Germany say, well, that was a situation he was maneuvered into basically by Western intelligence and West German intelligence so that they would get rid of somebody who wanted dialogue and peace. And so what this would be was something similar, except on a Scandinavian level. And then when Palmer didn't listen, as it were, I mean, it's like several warnings. Maybe he was killed because he was just he didn't get the message about the submarines. Submarine operations were telling him, don't talk to the Soviets. And he carried on and he was going to go and talk to Gorbachev, and then he was killed. I don't have any proof of that. Anyway, We were talking before the show, Martin, and you've got a very different set of perspectives and contacts because you spoke to this guy Topol, whose books I read. He was a Soviet dissident, thriller writer, journalist, and he said there were Soviet submarines and they were going to place hydrogen bombs there. What's your take on that?
Well, I think it's probably true, and they did. This was a Soviet dissident who came to the West, Edward Topol, reinvented himself as a very successful thriller writer. And the book sold not super bestsellers, but sold very well. And he sold the film rights for two or three of them for $900,000 each. So he was a very well. When I knew him in the late 1980s and 1990s, I think I lost track of him over the years, different things, but he was a good friend to me for many years, and I think he died a number of years ago. He would be a very old man now. Edward Topol, Topol, and in fact, here is a novel he wrote. You can get it on Amazon.com very easily on this very subject. Submarine 137. That's the title of the book in English, and the theme of the book. And he discussed it with me many times in his other books too, was very precisely that back in those days he had access to the elements of the Soviet defense establishment. And he said, yes, they did have, were carrying out submarine. It isn't to say that they did everything they were accused of. There were, it isn't to say that, personally, I think everything you say is exactly accurate and right, Pele, and that on the West, we were playing our political and strategic games as well, but they were also playing theirs, and they weren't just games. According to Eddie, what they were actually doing was placing hydrogen bombs, thermonuclear weapons, on the sea floor of Sweden. And the concept was that if it came to a war with the West, and Sweden, of course, was not in NATO, but they were looking at basically no real neutrals. Maybe countries in those days, Finland, they would have regarded as neutral, but they were still looking at Sweden as basically as an adjunct of the West, even though it was neutral and was not in NATO. But that they were placing thermonuclear weapons on the seafloor
Mm.
to set off enormous tidal waves that would drown Stockholm and other coastal Swedish cities. And of course, if they did that there, they could have contemplated doing it on the continental shelf of the United States or Britain as well. That would have been much more risky for them because the British and US, as you say, and French, and Dutch too, and Norwegian coast navies and coastal defenses were much larger and more widespread. But there was at least talk that this was being contemplated and being done. And we do know as a fact today that the Russians today have an undersea long range nuclear torpedo weapon, which for which there is no defense. It can go at around 400 knots underwater, like a torpedo, with a large thermonuclear warhead. And if it was sent off, it could set off a tidal wave of water that could drown the United States East Coast, that could drown where we are on coastal New Jersey, that could also have equally devastating effects on San Francisco or LA on the West Coast. And there is no question they have these weapons, and there is no question that there is no operational defense against them, which from my perspective is a very good reason not to be so incredibly stupid in the West as to encourage the Ukrainians, who would not do it themselves, but to basically set up the Ukrainians, as we were discussing before, to fire missiles into the heart of Russia, because it's like angering a dragon or a dinosaur, or at the very least a mammoth or a bull elephant in its nest or in its home, so that it'll come out and eat you alive. I agree with the points that you were making before about the increasing tensions we're even seeing over the past week in Central Europe. And as you say, we may be discussing this or exploring it with our guests in later programs. But the one thing I'll say here is when you see commentators of the highest caliber, like Professor John Mearsheimer, Colonel Doug McGregor, Colonel Dan Davis, our friend who we've had on our show, Colonel Larry Johnson, people of the Scott Ritter, the former UN investigator, when you have people of such stature and such seriousness, all of them warning that NATO has crossed the red line against Russia and that the Russian reaction could be overwhelming and unpredictable and could come at any time. And it's not just Scott saying this, it's not just Colonel McGregor saying this, it's Professor Mearsheimer. They're all saying this. They're all saying this. And of course, even more than we are on the eastern seaboard here in the US, you, and as you pointing out, are on the front line of this.